There comes a moment in every relationship with an avoidant when two invisible lines get crossed simultaneously, creating a psychological chasm that can never be bridged. For the partner, it's the quiet moment when hope finally dies and they stop believing change is possible. For the avoidant, it's the terrifying realization that they've pushed away someone irreplaceable and their typical mind game tactics no longer work. Both cross their own point of no return, but from opposite directions, creating a tragic irony where understanding arrives too late for repair. The partner's point of no return isn't dramatic. It's the subtle shift from fighting for the relationship to protecting themselves from it. It happens when their nervous system stops responding to breadcrumbs, when their heart no longer races at the possibility of reconnection, when they finally accept that love without reciprocity isn't actually love at all. They don't announce this crossing, they simply stop being available for the chaos, stop making excuses for the inconsistency, stop investing in potential rather than reality. Meanwhile, the avoidant experiences their own point of no return, the dawning awareness that their partner's energy has fundamentally shifted in a way that can't be manipulated back. They sense the change before they understand it. Their usual push-pull tactics generate indifference instead of anxiety. Their withdrawal no longer creates pursuit. Their breadcrumbs are met with polite but detached responses. For the first time, they're facing the genuine possibility of permanent loss, and their control over the dynamic has evaporated. The cruel irony is that both people often reach clarity about what they actually want at the exact moment it becomes impossible to have it. The partner finally understands their worth and stops accepting crumbs just as the avoidant realizes they've been starving someone precious. The avoidant finally grasps the value of what they're losing just as their partner stops being willing to be lost. This isn't about blame or fault. It's about psychological patterns that create inevitable outcomes when left unaddressed. The partner's point of no return represents their nervous system's healthy refusal to continue accepting emotional scraps. The avoidance point of no return represents their belated recognition that their fear-based patterns have destroyed something they actually valued. Both crossings are protective mechanisms, but they protect in opposite directions. One toward self-preservation, the other toward desperate recognition of loss. The first warning sign, when love becomes labor. The transformation from effortless affection to exhausting effort happens so gradually that neither person recognizes it until the relationship has become a second job nobody applied for. What began as natural caring slowly morphs into strategic emotional management, where every interaction requires careful calculation about timing, approach, and expected outcome. The partner finds themselves constantly monitoring the avoidance mood, adjusting their own needs to match their partner's capacity, and performing emotional labor that feels more like crisis management than love. For the partner, loving an avoidant starts to feel like tending a garden in hostile soil. No matter how much care, attention, and resources they pour in, nothing seems to grow consistently. They find themselves walking on eggshells, not because their partner is abusive, but because their partner's emotional availability fluctuates so unpredictably that every conversation becomes a calculated risk. Simple requests for connection turn into negotiations, expressions of need become sources of conflict, and sharing feelings requires the same energy as preparing for battle. The labor shows up in how they have to manage their own natural responses to maintain relationship stability. They learn to suppress their excitement about good news because their partner might withdraw from their enthusiasm. They modulate their disappointment about cancelled plans because expressing hurt triggers their partner's defensiveness. They become experts at reading micro-expressions, analyzing text tone, and predicting emotional weather patterns with the intensity of a meteorologist tracking hurricanes. Meanwhile, the avoidant experiences their own version of love becoming labor, the exhausting work of managing their internal anxiety while trying to maintain connection. Every relationship milestone feels like climbing a mountain while carrying emotional baggage they can't set down. They're constantly battling their impulse to flee, their need for space conflicting with their partner's need for closeness, their desire for love warring with their terror of vulnerability. Maintaining the relationship requires them to fight against their own nervous system daily. The avoidance labor involves performing availability they don't genuinely feel while managing the guilt about their emotional limitations. They force themselves through conversations about feelings that make them want to crawl out of their skin. They participate in relationship rituals that trigger their commitment fears while trying to hide their internal panic. They attempt to provide reassurance they can't authentically offer while dealing with their own need for constant emotional escape routes. Both people begin to recognize that what should feel natural now requires enormous effort. The partner notices they're thinking about the relationship constantly, analyzing interactions, strategizing approaches, preparing for potential conflicts. What used to be spontaneous affection becomes calculated emotional investments with uncertain returns. They're no longer being themselves in the relationship, they're being who they think they need to be to make it work. The avoidant realizes they're performing relationship participation rather than naturally engaging in it. Every gesture of affection feels forced, every commitment creates internal resistance. Every moment of intimacy requires them to overcome psychological barriers that seem to grow stronger over time rather than weaker. They're fighting their own instincts to maintain something that their nervous system interprets as threatening. The warning sign becomes impossible to ignore when both people are exhausted by their own efforts to make the relationship function. The partner is tired from accommodating, adjusting, and accepting less than they need. The avoidant is drained from battling their own psychological patterns while trying to show up consistently. Neither person is experiencing the ease and joy that healthy relationships provide. Instead, they're both working overtime to create something that resembles functional love. This labor-intensive dynamic creates resentment on both sides, though it manifests differently. The partner becomes resentful about having to minimize their needs and maximize their patience without receiving the same consideration in return. The avoidant becomes resentful about feeling pressured to provide emotional availability that doesn't come naturally to them while dealing with the guilt of disappointing someone they care about. The relationship becomes a constant project rather than a source of comfort, requiring both people to be on all the time rather than allowing them to simply be themselves. This is the first clear signal that something fundamental is broken in the dynamic. Love shouldn't require this much management, relationships shouldn't demand this much strategy, and caring for someone shouldn't feel like a full-time job with no days off. The breaking point, when hope dies. The death of hope doesn't announce itself with drama or fanfare. It arrives quietly, like air slowly leaking from a tire, until one day you realize it's completely flat. For the partner, this moment comes after countless cycles of disappointment followed by renewed optimism, each time believing that this conversation, this fight, this breakdown will finally be the catalyst that creates lasting change. But hope dies when the pattern becomes more predictable than the person, when their partner's promises carry less weight than their track record. The partner's hope begins its slow death through accumulated evidence that change isn't coming. Not because their avoidant partner is malicious or deliberately hurtful, but because their capacity for emotional growth seems fundamentally limited by forces stronger than their desire to improve. Each time the avoidant retreats after a moment of intimacy, each cancelled plan followed by a casual excuse, each deep conversation that leads nowhere builds a case against hope that becomes impossible to ignore. This death happens in layers, like grief that must be processed repeatedly. First dies the hope that they'll spontaneously become emotionally available without prompting. Then dies the hope that consistent communication about needs will eventually create lasting behavioral change. Next dies the hope that their love will be powerful enough to heal their partner's attachment wounds. Finally dies the hope that waiting patiently will eventually be rewarded with the relationship they've been imagining. For the avoidant, their own version of hope dies when they realize their partner is no longer fighting for the relationship with the same intensity. They notice the shift in their partner's energy, less urgency around relationship discussions, less emotional reactivity to their withdrawal, less investment in trying to change or understand them. The hope that dies for them is the unconscious belief that their partner's love is unconditional and infinitely patient. The avoidant's dying hope manifests as the growing realization that they may have pushed past their partner's emotional limits. They begin to sense that the patience they've been taking for granted has boundaries, that the forgiveness they've been relying on has reached its capacity, that the love they've been testing has finally failed their tests. This recognition creates its own form of panic, not the panic of intimacy, but the panic of genuine loss. Both people experience the death of hope differently but simultaneously. The partner stops believing their avoidant will ever show up consistently, while the avoidant stops believing their partner will continue accepting their inconsistency indefinitely. These realizations create a shift in the relationship's foundation, from hope-based investment to reality-based assessment. The partner's hope dies when they finally understand that their avoidant partner's limitations aren't temporary obstacles to overcome, but permanent features to accept or reject. This isn't about giving up on someone's potential for growth. It's about accepting that growth timelines don't align with relationship needs, that healing happens on individual schedules that don't accommodate partnership requirements. For the avoidant, hope dies when they recognize that their coping mechanisms have become relationship destruction mechanisms. They see clearly how their patterns of withdrawal, mixed signals, and emotional unavailability have systematically worn down their partner's faith in the relationship's future. The hope that they could maintain connection while avoiding vulnerability proves impossible to sustain. The death of hope creates a strange form of clarity for both people. The partner stops living in the future tense of what the relationship could become and starts evaluating what it actually is in the present moment. The avoidant stops assuming they have unlimited chances to figure out their feelings and starts recognizing that their indecision has consequences they can't control. The silent shift, when you stop fighting. The most telling sign that a relationship with an avoidant has crossed the point of no return isn't an explosive argument or dramatic confrontation. It's the eerie calm that settles over the dynamic when one person simply stops engaging with the patterns that have defined their connection. For the partner, this shift manifests as a quiet withdrawal of emotional investment, not born from anger or spite, but from a profound exhaustion that has finally reached its natural conclusion. The partner's energy begins to redirect itself away from relationship maintenance and towards self-preservation in ways that feel almost automatic. They stop initiating conversations about relationship issues because they've accepted that these discussions don't lead to lasting change. They stop explaining their feelings when their needs aren't met because they've realized that understanding isn't the same as caring, and caring isn't the same as changing. The constant emotional labor of trying to bridge the gap between their partner's capacity and their own needs simply stops. This isn't a strategic decision or a manipulation tactic. It's their nervous system's natural response to chronic disappointment. Their body and mind have reached a saturation point where continued investment feels harmful rather than hopeful. They stop fighting not because they don't care, but because they finally understand that their caring hasn't been creating the changes they need to feel secure and valued in the relationship. The avoidant experiences this shift as a strange and unsettling change in the relationship's emotional temperature. Their partner becomes mysteriously peaceful about behaviors that used to trigger discussions, hurt feelings, or attempts at connection. When they withdraw, their partner doesn't pursue. When they send mixed signals, their partner doesn't seek clarification. When they cancel plans or act distant, their partner simply adjusts without complaint or conversation. For the avoidant, this change feels simultaneously liberating and terrifying. On one hand, the pressure they've been feeling to manage their partner's emotional reactions has lifted. They can engage in their typical patterns without generating the conflicts they've been dreading. On the other hand, their partner's lack of response triggers their own abandonment fears in ways they didn't expect. The pursuit they were avoiding becomes the validation they realized they needed. The partner's cessation of fighting manifests in practical ways that signal fundamental change. They stop bringing up the future of the relationship because they've accepted that their partner can't or won't engage with long-term planning. They stop asking for explanations when their partner's behavior seems contradictory because they've learned that the explanations don't lead to different choices. They stop hoping each interaction will be different. because they've integrated the reality of who their partner actually is. This shift creates a paradoxical dynamic where the relationship becomes more peaceful but less intimate. Without the constant tension of unmet needs and disappointed expectations, day-to-day interactions can feel easier and more comfortable. But this comfort comes at the cost of authentic connection. The partner has essentially decided to stop being vulnerable about what they actually need from the relationship. The avoidant often misinterprets this change as relationship improvement, not recognizing that their partner has essentially given up on having their deeper needs met. They appreciate the reduced conflict without understanding that it comes from their partner's resignation rather than genuine acceptance. The relationship feels more manageable to them because their partner has stopped making it unmanageable. But this management comes from detachment, not accommodation. Meanwhile, the partner experiences a strange form of relief mixed with sadness. The constant stress of hoping for change, fighting for attention, and managing disappointment has been replaced by a kind of emotional numbness that feels both protective and lonely. They're no longer hurt by their partner's limitations because they're no longer expecting those limitations to change. The silence that replaces fighting isn't peaceful, it's hollow. Conversations become surface level, not because conflict has been resolved, but because deeper topics have been abandoned as futile. The partner stops sharing their authentic feelings because they've learned these feelings don't inspire the responses they need. The avoidant stops worrying about their partner's reactions because their partner has stopped having the reactions that made them anxious. This shift marks the relationship's transition from actively dysfunctional to passively unsustainable. The fighting that once characterized their dynamic served a purpose. It was the partner's attempt to bridge the gap between their needs and their partner's capacity. When that fighting stops, it signals that they've accepted the gap as permanent and started protecting themselves from its effects. The eerie calm that follows isn't resolution, it's resignation. Both people sense that something fundamental has changed, but they interpret the change differently. The partner feels the relief of no longer beating their head against an unmovable wall. The avoidant feels the unease of sensing that their partner has moved beyond the reach of their usual relationship management strategies. The emotional detachment, when their opinion stops mattering. The most profound shift in crossing the point of no return happens when the avoidant's thoughts, feelings, and opinions about their partner become genuinely irrelevant to their partner's sense of self-worth and daily emotional state. This isn't the bitter indifference of someone trying to prove they don't care. It's the authentic liberation that comes when someone realizes they no longer need external validation from someone who's proven incapable of providing it consistently. For the partner, this detachment manifests as a surprising lack of emotional response to situations that once triggered intense reactions. When their avoidant partner criticizes them, dismisses their feelings, or questions their choices, they notice the words landing without creating the familiar sting of hurt or surge of defensive energy. Their partner's approval or disapproval has somehow lost its power to affect their mood, their self-perception, or their decision-making process. This emotional detachment isn't numbness or suppression. It's the natural result of their nervous system finally accepting that this person's opinions aren't reliable indicators of their worth, attractiveness, or value. They've internalized the understanding that someone who can't show up consistently in a relationship also can't be trusted to accurately assess their partner's qualities, efforts, or lovability. The avoidant experiences this shift as a fundamental change in their power dynamics within the relationship. They realize their partner is no longer seeking their validation, no longer waiting for their approval, no longer adjusting their behavior based on their reactions. This loss of influence can be deeply unsettling because it removes one of their primary forms of control within the relationship, the ability to regulate their partner's emotional state through their responses. For the partner, this detachment brings unexpected freedom. They stop second-guessing their appearance before seeing their avoidant partner because their partner's reaction no longer determines their confidence level. They stop editing their personality or interests to match what they think will generate positive responses. They make decisions based on their own values and desires rather than calculating how those choices will be received. The avoidant notices their partner has become mysteriously immune to their typical emotional management strategies. When they withdraw affection to create anxiety, their partner remains calm and continues with their own activities. When they offer sudden warmth after a period of distance, their partner receives it pleasantly but without the grateful intensity they've come to expect. Their emotional hot and cold tactics no longer generate the responses that made them feel powerful and needed. This detachment extends to how the partner processes their avoidant partner's behavior and choices. They stop taking their partner's withdrawal personally because they understand it's about their partner's limitations rather than their own inadequacies. They stop feeling responsible for their partner's emotional state or relationship satisfaction because they've accepted that these are internal issues beyond their influence. The partner's newfound emotional independence often triggers the avoidant's abandonment fears in unexpected ways. Seeing their partner thrive without their validation, make decisions without their input, and maintain emotional stability regardless of their behavior creates a panic they didn't anticipate. They realize they may have underestimated their partner's strength and overestimated their own importance in their partner's life. For the avoidant, watching their partner become emotionally self-sufficient can feel like losing their primary role in the relationship. If their partner doesn't need their approval, doesn't seek their validation, and doesn't adjust their behavior based on their responses, what function do they serve? This realization can create the kind of relationship anxiety they've been trying to avoid through their distancing strategies. The partner experiences this detachment as profoundly liberating but also somewhat sad. They feel free from the emotional roller coaster of seeking approval from someone incapable of providing it consistently, but they also feel the loss of hoping their partner would become someone who could appreciate and validate them properly. The sadness isn't about losing their partner, it's about losing the fantasy of who their partner could have been. This emotional detachment becomes complete when the partner realizes they would make the same life choices whether their avoidant partner approved of them or not. Their career decisions, social choices, personal goals, and daily activities are now based on their own values and desires, rather than calculated to generate positive responses from someone whose emotional availability fluctuates unpredictably. The avoidant often attempts to regain their influence through more dramatic gestures, sudden declarations of love, promises to change, or behaviors designed to trigger their partner's old patterns of emotional dependence. But genuine detachment can't be manipulated back into attachment. Once someone has internalized their own worth independent of their partner's validation, that internal security remains stable regardless of external attempts to destabilize it. This detachment marks the relationship's final phase, not because either person stops caring, but because the partner has fundamentally restructured their emotional relationship to their avoidant partner's opinions and responses. They've moved from external validation to internal security, making them essentially unavailable for the kind of emotional dependency that characterized their earlier dynamic. The final recognition when you see them clearly. The most liberating and heartbreaking moment in a relationship with an avoidant comes when the fog of hope, potential, and wishful thinking finally lifts, revealing the person standing before you with startling clarity. This recognition isn't born from anger or resentment, but from the kind of clear-eyed acceptance that comes when you stop trying to change reality and start accepting it. For the partner, this moment represents the death of the fantasy version of their avoidant and the birth of genuine understanding about who they actually are. The partner's clear vision develops gradually, like adjusting to light after being in darkness for too long. They begin to see their avoidance patterns not as temporary obstacles to overcome or wounds to heal, but as fundamental aspects of their personality that exist independently of the relationship's influence. They recognize that their partner's emotional unavailability isn't something they're doing to them. It's something they do to everyone, including themselves, as a way of moving through the world. This clarity brings the painful recognition that their avoidant partner's limitations aren't personal failings that can be loved away, but genuine constraints on their capacity for intimacy that exist regardless of how patient, understanding, or accommodating their partner becomes. They see clearly that their partner's fear of vulnerability isn't about trust issues that can be resolved through consistent love. It's a core feature of their psychological makeup that influences every relationship they enter. The avoidant, meanwhile, experiences their own moment of recognition when they realize their partner has stopped seeing them through the lens of potential and started seeing them through the lens of reality. They sense that their partner is no longer making excuses for their behavior, no longer hoping for changes that aren't coming, no longer investing in the version of them that could exist if they just tried harder or cared more. For the partner, this recognition brings a strange form of peace mixed with grief. They finally understand that their avoidant partner's inability to show up consistently isn't about not caring enough. It's about being fundamentally unable to tolerate the vulnerability that consistent showing up requires. This understanding eliminates the personal rejection they've been feeling and replaces it with something closer to compassion for someone whose own psychological patterns trap them in cycles they can't seem to break. The clarity extends to recognizing how their avoidant partner's coping mechanisms, while protecting them from vulnerability, also prevent them from experiencing the kind of deep connection they claim to want. The partner sees that their avoidant isn't just hurting them, they're hurting themselves by choosing safety over growth, comfort over challenge, familiar patterns over the unknown territory of genuine intimacy. This recognition helps the partner understand that their avoidance behavior throughout the relationship has been consistent with who they are rather than inconsistent with who they could become. The mixed signals weren't confusion. They were the natural result of someone who wants connection but fears it equally. The hot and cold patterns weren't intentional cruelty. They were the predictable outcome of someone trying to maintain relationship benefits while avoiding relationship responsibilities. The avoidant experiences their own recognition when they see that their partner has stopped trying to change them and started accepting them exactly as they are. Not because acceptance means staying, but because acceptance means seeing clearly enough to make authentic choices. They realize their partner now understands their limitations, not as challenges to overcome, but as permanent features to work around or walk away from. For the partner, this clear vision eliminates the cognitive dissonance they've been carrying between their avoidance potential and their reality. They stop making excuses for their partner's behavior because they no longer see the behavior as aberrant, they see it as characteristic. They stop expecting different outcomes from the same inputs because they finally understand that their partner's capacity is what it is, not what it could become with enough time or love. The recognition brings profound sadness, but also profound relief. The sadness comes from grieving the relationship they imagined could exist if both people were different than they are. The relief comes from no longer having to carry the exhausting hope that something fundamental will change about their partner's approach to intimacy and commitment.